Hello, welcome to Chemistry 101. Today we're going to review significant figures. I'm Dr. Sarah Schlosser, so grab your paper and pencil, grab your notes that have your rules that we've talked about in class, and let's go through some practice problems with significant figures. Remember, when we're trying to count significant figures, the first thing we need to do is find any number that is not a zero. If it's not a zero, when we're just counting from a number, we're going to say, yes, it is significant. So let's look at this first problem. Anything that's not a zero, I like to put a little check mark over so I know I need to count it. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This problem has 5 sig figs. Okay, because they're all not zeros. I can go to the next problem and I can say not a zero, not a zero. So I know I at least have 2 sig figs. The question is, how many sig figs do I have? To do that, we have to get into our zero rules. And the zero rules are a little more complicated. There is a yes, there is a no, and there is a maybe, just to keep life interesting. So yeses, if they're in the middle of non-zeros, then we're always going to say yes. So in this example that we started, we had a 1 and a 3. There's 2 zeros that are in the middle of the 1 and the 3, the two things that are not zeros. So those we're going to count. So in this case, we have 4 sig figs. Try this one with me. What would you check mark, and do you count the zero? Not a zero, not a zero. I look in the middle, and there is a zero, but since it's in the middle, I get to count it. So if you said 3 sig figs, you're correct. What about zeros in front? Here I have a problem that has 2 things that are not zeros, but all of these zeros come in front of the first non-zero. Those we're never going to count. If they're in front of the first non-zero. That doesn't mean they're not important. I can't rewrite the number as 45. If this is the amount of medicine I'm supposed to give my patient, giving them 45 would be a serious problem. But they're not significant. Going to our next problem. Here I have 3 things that are not zeros, and then I have 2 zeros at the end. The zeros at the end are the maybe. Zeros after the last non-zero. Sometimes those will count, and sometimes they won't. When do we count them? We say yes if there is a decimal anywhere in the problem. If there's no decimal, we say no. Do I have a decimal anywhere in this problem? No decimal. So these zeros at the end do not get to get counted. Again, it's not that they're not important. If this is your paycheck, you don't want your employer to round to $125. You still want to keep the $12,000, but those zeros are not significant. Remember, significant only tells us how far we were able to measure when we actually took the readings. No. Remember, significant figures only tell us how much we were able to measure for sure and what our one uncertain, rounded, estimated answer was. So, make sure you have your rules written down, and let's try some more problems. Let's do some more practice problems. For the first one, let's practice one more time figuring out which zeros to count and which zeros not to count. We know we count anything that's not a zero, so we know we're going to count those too. For the zeros, we have to go back to our rules. The ones in front, we don't count. The ones in the middle, we do count. And the ones at the end, because there's a decimal in the problem, we're going to count. Okay, so in this case, we have 4 sig figs. Now, some of your problems aren't going to ask you to identify them by the rules. They're going to ask you to round to a certain number of sig figs, because this is what you're going to do in your calculations. After you do your calculations, you have to round it to the correct number of sig figs. So let's say I punch a problem in and I get this number in my calculator. And I need to round my answer to 3 sig figs. 1, 2, 3. I look at the number next to it and decide whether or not to round up. If that number is 5 or more, I round up. 9 is definitely more than 5, so this is going to become 1.25 for my 3 sig figs. What about the next problem? If I'm rounding it to 3 sig figs, 1, 2, 3, the 5 looks at the 4. Well, there's a 9 after the 4, but I can't look at that. You can't round more than once. I can only look at the number directly after the number I'm rounding. That's a 4, which is less than 5. So this one is going to stay 1.35. I'm not going to round up. What if I had the number 2010, and they told me that I wanted to write it with 2 sig figs? That one's a little tricky. I need this to be significant, and I need this to be significant. But that's my 2 sig figs. I look at the next number, and it's a 1. I can't round up. It's less than 5. So somehow, I have to figure out how to write 2000 with 2 sig figs. I need this 0 to count, but not these 2. To do that, I'm going to have to put it in scientific notation. Remember, zeros at the end don't count if there's not a decimal. But if I put a decimal in by putting it in scientific notation, I can choose how many zeros to count. Remember, when we put it in scientific notation, we figure out where the decimal was. We move it over to where we want to be, and we need a number between 1 and 9 in front of the decimal. So in this case, we're going to have 2 point. Any zeros I show after this are going to be significant because I have a decimal. So I only want to show 1 so that I have my 2 sig figs. If I'm only showing 1, I still have to keep the place. I can't round my $2,000 down to $2. That's not fair. Remember, we do our times 10. In this case, we moved it 1, 2, 3 places. It was a big number, so this is going to be a positive 3. So we can use scientific notation when we have too many zeros, and we need some of them to be significant and some of them not to be. As you go through your problems, you're going to have to keep coming back to these rules and remembering your sig figs, because every problem we're going to do sig figs. So make sure you have good examples written down, make sure you have your steps, and go through your steps one by one, and you'll do great on your assignments. That's it for today. We'll come back and talk about more stuff later. Good luck and have fun.